Oh, hi. I'm Owlbear Rogue. Welcome to the cave. Or perhaps, for just a little while, welcome to the unknown. For the next few weeks, I'm going to be celebrating October by highlighting spooky movies and TV series that have taught me delightful lessons about storytelling and how to be a better DM. If you haven't guessed it, in this video, we're wandering into the misty woods of a bygone Americana fantasy with Over the Garden Wall. What is this place? How did we wind up here? Will we ever find our way out? Where have we come? And where shall we end? If you've never had the nostalgia-drenched pleasure, let me introduce you. Over the Garden Wall is an animated miniseries that premiered on Cartoon Network in 2014. It's the brainchild of a man named Patrick McHale, features dreamy music by the Blasting Company, featuring Jack Jones, and has a star-studded cast of voice actors, including Elijah Wood, Melanie Lynskey, Tim Curry, Sam Raimi, and more. I wasn't aware of the series when it first came out, to be honest. I watched it for the first time just a couple years ago, but I immediately became lost in the unknown. It is, in my opinion, an expertly crafted story, and, well, I live for running D&D games. The DM brain never turns off, and I learned so much from this piece of art that made me a better DM. The series actually began life as a short called The Tome of the Unknown. If that doesn't sound like a badass TTRPG campaign, I don't know what does. In the spirit of Over the Garden Wall, let's take this video in chapters. Side note, run away if you haven't seen Over the Garden Wall before. Watch it first. This video will contain some spoilers. Chapter 1. The setting is a character in your game. In Over the Garden Wall, two brothers, Greg and Wirt, and Greg's friend, a frog who goes by many different names, find themselves lost in a place called the Unknown, a vintage fall Americana dreamscape, heavily inspired by the creator's collection of kooky antique postcards. Greg and Wirt and the cast of characters they encounter in the Unknown are all endearing in their own way, but I would argue the most prominent character in the series, and the one that has kept me coming back again and again, is the Unknown itself. I love this series because of how it makes me feel, because of what it evokes, and the setting does the majority of the heavy lifting there. I can feel the bite of late autumn air. I can smell wood smoke. I can hear the rustling of leaves, and they're crunching under my feet. It's pumpkins and skeletons and witches and spooks. It's taverns and talking animals and riverboats. It's whimsy and it's death. It's comfort by the hearth and it's icy winter, unstoppable on the horizon. It's a homesickness for a place I've never been. People play D&D and other TTRPGs for different reasons. Some people play because of who they want to be. The fantasy of being someone who wields magic or incredible strength, the hero of a grand adventure. For myself and a lot of my players, I play not so much because of who I wish I could be, but because of where I wish I could be. I want to escape into a world of fantasy the same way I did when I daydreamed or pretended as a kid. When I got lost in a book that I snuck to bed with me late at night, hoping Mom didn't catch me awake past my bedtime. That's why if you watch my other videos about the one-shots I create, I so often start with a genre, with a vibe. Where do I want to take my players? How do I want them to feel while they're there? When you have that book that you're obsessed with, and you have to put it down to go to school or work, and you can't wait to run back to that place as soon as you can, what is that place and how do I create it? Narnia or Middle Earth, a windswept prairie, a jungle island, wherever it may be. You crave being there. That's the experience I want to create. And honestly, I think it's a big part of what keeps some of my players coming back. I rewatch Over the Garden Wall. I reread Lord of the Rings because I miss the place they take me to. I have players who come back again and again for years-long campaigns, partially because of where I've taken them. There's more to it than that, certainly. I actually have a video on all the tools I pull out of the toolbox to keep campaigns running for years, and I would love it if you would check it out. But I know the fantasy of place is a part of it. In my 4th of July Fortress one-shot, for example, I want my players to remember the wild freedom of summer, whether they experienced that as a kid or they just wish they had. I want them to feel the sweat drip down their back, the sweet stickiness of a bomb pop melting faster than they can eat it. I want them to hear the marching band and the parade, the singing of the cicadas. When they're done, I want them to feel not just that they went on a journey, but that they went to a place, a special place they want to come back to. You all know I typically skew towards creating homebrew content, but there are a few published D&D books that I use and borrow from heavily, and those are specifically the ones I feel like do the best job at evoking a unique, well-fleshed out setting. That is the number one thing of value to me when I buy a book. Can it help me send my players to a place they'll want to run back to? For me, those books are Curse of Strahd and the accompanying Ravenloft stuff, Wild Beyond the Witchlight, which you've heard me wax about poetic many times, Ghosts of the Saltmarsh, and recently I've been getting into the Planescapes box set. Talk about unique, well-fleshed out world, many years of history there. When I'm using the adventure in that set as a jumping off point for my next long-term campaign, the setting is the big thing that I'm focusing on. You may have heard me, again, wax poetic or idiotic, depending on your take, I suppose, about how much I believe in the psychological power and value of playing a TTRPG with your friends. I see it as akin to our ancestors huddled together against the dark, telling stories with words and shadows. I believe it feeds what we are as humans at our core. With stories that are passed down to us from this kind of tradition, whether it be Gilgamesh or the Iliad, Beowulf, the Icelandic sagas, on and on, different ones from different cultures. There's a power in how many people and how many generations have metaphorically gone on those journeys together. On a smaller scale, a beloved series like Over the Garden Wall has an echo of that power to unite thousands. But, one of the superpowers of a homebrew, in my opinion, and part of the magic of telling a story with a handful of friends in the privacy of your home, is how intimate the sharing of a setting, the experience of a world in that way, is. By the end, we've told a story together, had experiences together that in many ways are just as impactful on our brain as if we truly lived them. We saved the world, whatever strange, magical world it might be. And no one knows but us. Us few. Us friends. I would love to hear from you in the comments. What are the worlds that you return to in your head and your heart again and again? Are they books, movies, novels? What worlds have you created with your friends around the table with some dice and drinks that you'll never forget? What modules have you played that transported you that way? Anyway, you get the idea, my friends. Don't sleep on the setting. Think about where you want to go with your players and how you want them to feel in that place. Give them the sights, smells, and sounds. That leads us to our next chapter. Chapter 2, the music. Hot damn. I am enchanted by the music in Over the Garden Wall. I get goosebumps every time, and I mean every time I hear those first tinkling, haunting piano notes that open the series. I have excited anticipation for what's to come. I know exactly where I am. There's joy and danger ahead, and it feels like a kind of coming home. The soundtrack to Over the Garden Wall is a masterful extension of the setting. If the setting is one of the main characters, the soundtrack is that character's voice. I believe the act of making music, like telling stories around the fire, is one of the most profoundly human, worthwhile things that we can engage in. So it makes me sad that I myself am not a musician. So please forgive how fumbling and untechnical my assessment of the blasting company's work is going to be. Thankfully, I do have wildly talented friends who are musicians and some of my players that have told me I'm on the right track here. My understanding, limited though it may be, is that the music in Over the Garden Wall leans into minor keys, creating a sense of melancholy and unease. The musical phrases frequently don't resolve in the way you'd expect, and that adds to a sense of uncertainty, mystery. Finally, leaning into older styles of American music, this soundtrack would sound just right coming out of a Victrola, and it tugs at those nostalgia strings. Have you ever been driving along or shopping for groceries and a song comes over the speakers, and that song is a very particular song from a very particular time in your life? And now, good or bad, you travel back in time to that place and the person you were. One minute you're buying toilet paper, and the next you're 19, putting on blue eyeshadow from Christina Aguilera's Fetish makeup collection, throwing a plaid miniskirt over the top of your jeans. Someone's coming to pick you up, and you're going to go to the new blacklight mini golf place and see Moulin Rouge. You're young, you're in love, and you're telling your best friend about it on a phone with a very, very long cord. That's all probably just me, but you get the idea. Music is a powerful tool to transport us, and unlike so many parts of being a DM that take a lot of prep and thought, it is an easy tool to employ. It's practically a cheat code for vibe and atmosphere. Consider finding the perfect bit of music to play every single time you start a session of a particular campaign. As you find catch-up conversations dropping off and you start to recount what happened in your last session and re-describe the situation the PCs currently find themselves in, play the same bit of music every time, or the same bit of really distinctive ambiance. I suspect you'll find it goes a long way to focusing your players and whisking them right away to whatever world you want them in. Of course, then you can branch out with other music and ambiance for the rest of the game. When it comes to soundscapes for TTRPGs, oh, what a time to be alive. You can find ambiance for a lively village in the middle of a swamp. Voices and song combined with crickets and the slow flow of murky water. You can find things that are so specific. I use YouTube Premium for my stuff, but there are a ton of services out there that do the same thing. YouTube Premium, you say? In this economy? I know. It's rough out there, and not everyone will be able to prioritize spending money on something like that. I'm able to justify it because I use it for my work as well as for D&D. It's also my main source of just kind of chill out entertainment. If you can swing it, it's a great shortcut to atmosphere, mood, urgency, anxiety, whatever that vibe is you need. Chapter 3. What is the logic of your world? Please forgive me, friends. This next bit is going to be a bit meandering. The concept of this section is a little amorphous, a little nebulous, a little ooey-gooey, if you want to be scientific about it. I have a lot to say I want to say in this, but it hurts my brain a little trying to figure out how to do it, so I appreciate you, as always, bearing with me. The setting, the unknown in Over the Garden Wall, is, well, it's well named. I've already talked about how the unknown is a character in its own right. It is very mysterious. It is unknown. What is this place? How did these characters wind up there? What exactly is going on? Wirt and Greg for sure don't know those answers. The frog may or may not. Actually, if anyone knows what's going on, my money's on the frog. But anyhow, the unknown is a kind of dreamscape. Many have speculated it's meant to be a kind of purgatory, a retelling of the journey of Dante in Dante's Inferno. It's a mysterious place somewhere between life and death where souls mill around to see where they land. Whether that's true or not, there's definitely a dreamlike quality to the setting. And as such, the action of the story follows a kind of dream logic. When we talk about world building in TTRPGs, especially for those of us who do a lot of homebrew, we talk about creating different landscapes for your world, cities and towns, pantheons. Who are the gods there? What is the level of magic people have access to? Who's in power? What is the system of government? All those kinds of things. Very seldom do we stop to ask ourselves, what is the logic of our world? Each world has a logic, though, doesn't it? A certain way you can anticipate things will work. You see this really obviously in stories that play up the logic of a world for satire's sake. Shrek comes to mind. Shrek is sending up fairy tales, and fairy tales have their own sense of logic. You can expect certain things to happen, characters to behave certain ways, because you come to expect that that's how those types of worlds work. Depending on what type of story it is and what it wants to teach you, what the goal of that story was, what it wants you to take away from it, it's going to have different tropes, different logic. One of the reasons I love Wild Beyond the Witchlight is because it plays with that fairy tale logic in a similar way as Shrek. It's not as cynical as Shrek, which I also appreciate. But I'm really enjoying the new Planescapes adventure, as I had mentioned, partially because Sigil, where things take place there often, has its own way of being. Rules spoken and unspoken, and they are unique. There are things you can anticipate logically following one action or another, and you can play with that as a DM, either leaning into those expectations or subverting them when the story suits. The thing I'm struggling with here is how to explain to you the process of creating a logic for your world. I don't think I have the skills to take you all the way there, to be honest. It's a very instinctive process for me that comes from a lifelong love of stories and absorbing fantasy worlds. The best I can do is give you some examples in the following chapters of the world logic, or the sort of dream logic, as we said, on display in Over the Garden Wall, and hope you can use that as a jumping off point to start to understand. Also, there's a ton of creative, smart people who are fans of this channel, and I bet some of you can do a better job of explaining all this in the comments than I can. You are great, and I love you. If you can manage to create and attune yourself and your players to a strong sense of logic in your world, whatever it may be, it will color the actions they consider taking and the consequences they face as a result. It will make the events that unfold, especially calls that you make as a DM, seem less arbitrary and more, well, logical. This concept isn't really for beginners, I don't think. This is some advanced DMing, definitely not DMing 101. But whether you're new to running games or you're a seasoned veteran, thyme and oregano are my favorite seasonings. Let this idea roll around in your brain for a bit. As with anything I share, if you find it of use to you, huzzah! If not, you can leave it behind, like you're waking up from a strange dream. As I said, the idea of Over the Garden Wall's dream logic is going to follow us through a few more of the chapters of this video. Chapter 4. Don't be afraid to start in the middle of the action. There are several areas in Over the Garden Wall where the sense of dream logic I've been talking about really shines through. The first that jumped out to me literally made me sit up and say, wait, what did I miss? You can do that? Was the writer's willingness to plop us down into scenes that are already in progress. Several episodes, or chapters, begin with the characters in a place interacting with NPCs, and we have little to no context for what's going on. I noticed it most in Chapter 5, which is entitled Mad Love. The last we saw the characters in the previous episode, they were riding through the woods on a horse. Suddenly now, at the beginning of this episode, they're eating a meal. They're having tea at a mansion with a man named Quincy Endicott, notably voiced by John Cleese, who refers to them as his nephews. It's quickly revealed that they are not, in fact, his nephews. Where is this place? How did they get here? Who is this man? Why is the horse having tea with them? Clearly, some trickery and tomfoolery have happened between the last episode and this one, and we missed it. This is certainly how my dreams work. I find myself in a strange place or situation, but after the briefest moment of confusion, if that even, you just kind of roll with it. If that is something that makes sense in the logic of your world, I highly, highly encourage you to sometimes plop your PCs down into the thick of a situation. So often we creep into the beginning of the action, introduce your characters, you meet in a tavern, etc., etc. But there can be advantages to starting a one-shot, a session, or even the entire big adventure right in the thick of the action. What if, instead of role-playing keeping watch each night throughout a long journey, you simply say, as you approach your final destination, a terrible storm blows up. You're invited to take refuge in the manor house of an eccentric old man who keeps referring to you as his nephews. He's even invited your horse inside. The house seems strangely empty. As you sit down for tea, he begins telling you about how he made his fortune in the tea business. I'm not suggesting this is the best and only way to do things, never. But there's a time and place for it. You cut out some of the awkward fluff at the beginning of an adventure that it can be harder to get people who aren't seasoned role players to engage with some of that slower moving stuff. This way you give them a place and a person to react to. You don't always need to know how the party got someplace exactly. Sometimes it's good to trust your players to roll with you and fill in the gaps for themselves with interesting things. For some stories, like Over the Garden Wall, a bit of mystery, a little bit of disjointedness, a little bit of feeling out of control is part of the magic. Can you imagine if they had the narrator of Over the Garden Wall do a voiceover explaining everything that was happening and what situation the characters were in? It would be a very different show. It would be blasphemy, really. It would ruin the whole thing. It would be like, for example, just throwing a dart at the wall. It would be like forcing Harrison Ford to come back to the studio to do a voiceover explaining the whole story for the theatrical release of Blade Runner, instead of the pure artistry of the director's cut. That is something I definitely do not have strong feelings about. I'm not telling you to put your characters all the time, or your player characters all the time, in bad situations that they didn't earn, so to speak. You know what I mean? Don't take away control, but don't be afraid to cut out, again, some of the fluff, some of the build-up, and start right in on the action. Anyway, hopefully you get the idea. If the world supports something a little jarring happening, if your world's logic lets you plop your players down in that action, don't be afraid to spice it up and do that sometimes. Chapter 6. Your NPCs may not always be what they seem. Another piece of the dream logic of Over the Garden Wall is the ambiguous nature and moral alignments of the characters they meet on their journey. As with any good dream, animals can and do talk. Sometimes they even go to school and play brass instruments. A sweet girl could turn out to be a ghoul, and her seemingly ghoulish auntie might actually be trying to protect the protagonists. A frightening 20-foot-tall pumpkin man could turn out to be a little black cat. A cute bluebird in distress could really be trying to lure you into danger, but then might also become your friend. A gorilla terrifying the countryside might lose its head in a very Scooby-Doo turn of events and wind up being a well-meaning man who just got trapped in a gorilla suit. In dreams, people and things change. They morph and flow from one thing to another. One minute the world is safe, the next something is threatening, and vice versa. In my opinion, if the logic of your world supports it, this kind of NPC can enhance your games. I use a lot of this kind of NPC when I'm building adventures in the Feywild, or when my characters do have literal dreams. The Feywild is a world also that has a dreamlike quality to it, a sense that everything isn't what it seems. There's a lot of depth to NPCs created with that idea in mind. And let me be clear, I'm not telling you that what you need to do is make every single NPC the party comes across some kind of plant, waiting to betray them. What I am asking you to consider is adding some layers of complexity to them. The most interesting heroes, in my opinion, are the ones who do good despite deep flaws and struggles. The most interesting villains weren't born. They're doing things for their own reasons, some of which might be frighteningly sound if you hear them out. Two of my favorite characters in Over the Garden Wall are great examples of this. The first is Beatrice. She's the bluebird I mentioned earlier, voiced by the lovely Melanie Linsky. The brothers find her stuck in some brambles, I believe at the beginning of the tale. It can be argued that she may very well have intentionally stuck herself there as an excuse to meet them. At first she seems vulnerable. Then she seems helpful. She knows someone named Adelaide of the Pasture, a benevolent figure who might be able to help the boys find their way home. As an audience, we start asking to throw insight checks pretty quickly on that. She's a bit too eager to get them to this Adelaide. This is all until Beatrice starts to feel some real affection for the boys, to truly like them. Then she suddenly thinks maybe they should skip the visit to Adelaide's altogether. For a moment, she looks like a villain. It turns out Adelaide is a nasty witch who plans to harm the children. But then we go even deeper, and we learn there's more to Beatrice than any of these faces we've seen before have shown. Beatrice isn't supposed to be a bird. She's supposed to be a human. She's been cursed to be a bird. Even worse, her family was also cursed to be birds because of something Beatrice did. Adelaide has promised to undo the curse for her if she brings her children. There are layers here. Beatrice is a fundamentally good character, but she's being forced by desperate circumstances and the trickery of a person with wicked intentions to do something she knows isn't right. Ultimately, she redeems herself and helps Wirt save Greg in the end. One of my other favorite characters we see this kind of complexity from is Auntie Whispers. Auntie Whispers is voiced by Tim Curry, so of course she would be my favorite. The brothers stumble into a home where there's a beautiful young lady. She immediately is nervous and wants to hide them from a creature named Auntie Whispers, who's going to be back any minute. She intimates that terrible things will happen if Auntie Whispers catches them. Sure enough, when she shows her face, Auntie Whispers is a grotesque, hag-like blob of a thing. Seriously, she's very, very creepy. And she bosses the young woman around as if she were a slave, using a magical bell that seems to have some kind of power over the girl. Ultimately, it turns out the sweet young girl who's taken a shine to Wirt in particular is the real monster. She's been possessed by an evil spirit that causes her to eat anyone she can find after dark. Auntie Whispers didn't want anyone at the house because she didn't want anyone to get hurt. She gave the girl chores to keep her busy in the hopes of keeping her from doing things she would regret. The power to banish the evil spirit afflicting her is in the bell, and Wirt uses it to free her. That's when it's revealed that Auntie Whispers might not be bad, but she's also no saint. She could have driven off the spirit before with the bell, any time, but she loved the girl and was afraid she would leave her all alone and never come back if she didn't need her anymore. How many people died? And how long did the girl suffer unnecessarily because Auntie Whispers was afraid of loneliness? How does this translate into making NPCs for your games? Every shopkeeper your party runs across, every cook in the inn, doesn't have to have this kind of depth. That would be silly and exhausting. But if there are NPCs that are significant to this story, that your party's going to spend a lot of time with, consider building in some layers. Maybe they're doing a bad thing for the right reason, or a good thing to further a dubious end. If there is a time and a place for bad guys who are just bad and good guys who are just good, which there absolutely is. I always like to think of Shakespeare's famous line from Much Ado About Nothing, when the villain, Count John, says, "It must not be denied, I am but a plain-dealing villain." If there's space for that and fun to be had with it, there's room for this too. In the right kind of game, use those dream logic NPCs, who are never quite what they seem, to add depth and intriguing ambiguity to your party's decisions, their loyalties. Let these NPCs send them off on side quests. If nothing else, you'll reward that player that invested in their insight skill. As we talk about side quests, that brings us to Chapter 7, Balancing an Overarching Plot with Exploration. I'm in a fairly large Facebook group where DMs, in theory, share resources with each other. You're probably familiar with groups like this. Far too often, despite the best intentions, like all things on the internet, it really devolves into trolling and very, very, very boring wars over whose edition was better, why people are still even playing certain systems, general yucking of other people's yums, policing other people's fun, and spouting about one's own preferences, and how they're not just correct, but morally superior and more valuable than everyone else's. You know, Generation Hoopla's embracing of the what's-its is immaturity and a sign of the decline of our society, and ultimately it will ruin everything, blah, 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 blah. One of the conversations that quickly went down that path recently was how this original poster felt DMs were shooting themselves in the foot by planning campaigns with overarching plots. It was better, easier, more realistic, and less likely to lead to the implosion of our hobby and the end of the world if you just played modular sandbox games. I don't want to sound too hard on that person. I'm sure the way that they play works for them, and they were genuinely trying to be helpful by making other people's games work for them too. But I just don't take with that all or nothing kind of thinking about D&D. Over the Garden Wall shows us you can have both. A big plot, a big problem that eventually has to be solved, and a lot of wacky, sometimes totally unrelated side adventures along the way. You can, as Greg might assure you, have your potatoes and molasses, and eat it too. The big problem is obvious from the moment we meet Greg and Wirt. They're lost. They don't know where they are or how they got there. They need to stay safe in the unknown. They need to get home. Very soon we learn of the existence of a terrible creature inhabiting these woods and preying on children, called the Beast. It seems pretty obvious from the get-go that the brothers are headed towards an eventual reckoning with this sinister figure. You hear me talk a lot about how the more mysterious and the less direct time you spend with your monsters, the scarier they will be. The Beast is a perfect example of this. Even his name is vague as hell, the Beast. I stand on this soapbox. I give my full-throated support to having a big problem like this in your games. Often in fantasy it involves saving the world, but it doesn't always have to be on that scale. It can be your party lost in the woods, trying to save their own personal little worlds, terrorized by a mysterious beast. An overarching plot is a touchstone for your party, something they can return to when they feel lost themselves. They don't know which direction to go next. When they do that thing where they stop and ask, wait, what are we doing? There's a built-in sense of purpose to the action. But for a long campaign, this is a big but, it's hard to make one problem complex enough to last for years all on its own. And there's value to having unexpected things happen, dancing off on a tangent. Maybe one of those tantalizing NPC side quests we just talked about. You can play in the sand and still save the playground from the big bad. Over the Garden Wall does this beautifully. The way it gets away with it, and something I try to emulate sometimes in my games, is the big plot exists, but it doesn't have to be solved this minute. There's a lot to discover about what's really going on with that plot. Places to travel to, people to meet, mysteries to solve, and there's time to explore. For Greg and Wirt, exploring is an enormous part of what they're doing, and they see so many different things the unknown has to offer. They visit schoolhouses for forest animals, mysterious mansions, riverboats sailed by frogs, festivals held by skeletons wearing pumpkin heads. These things don't distract from the bigger picture, they help compose the big picture. Each story, though it may be self-contained in its own way, is a chance for them to learn about their world, their big problem, and about themselves. So put a very important problem or threat in front of the players, one that will take them a long time to confront, but don't have it breathing down their neck every second. Give them space to get lost on their way there. Chapter 8. Consider divorcing your big bad endgame from a fixed time or place. Part of accomplishing balance between big plots and side quests, and something Over the Garden Wall does, again, really well, is divorcing the big bad from having to exist in a certain time or place. The Beast is everywhere in the unknown, seemingly always watching, occasionally directly threatening. There's no clear, castle turret on the horizon the party has to make their way to. The Beast is inevitable, but not imminent. I'm going to say that again. The bad guy, the big problem, is inevitable, but not imminent. The turning point that ultimately brings our characters Wirt and Greg into conflict with the Beast is an internal trigger, not something that happens to them or a physical place they finally arrive at. There is a physical change that happens in the world when they ultimately go toe-to-toe with the Beast. The bucolic autumn they've been wandering through turns bitter cold and begins to slip into winter, as autumns always do. You get the sense, though, that in the unknown, this was triggered less by the passage of time or the coverage of distance. Time is such an ooey gooey concept in a dream world like the one they're in. And it's triggered more by the emotional and psychological place the characters reach, particularly Wirt. He's entering a winter of the soul. He's literally not willing to go on anymore, and he lays down and gives up. Is this an idea, the concept that a state of mind or morale might be what triggers the final action and catharsis of the story? Is it something realistic to expect from every game and every group of players? Of course not. I am not suggesting that at all. But divorcing the resolution of your big plot from a certain unchangeable point in time and space can be of value if you want to give your players the freedom to explore other plots along the way. Having the big bad ultimately strike at a time that makes thematic sense for your party and where they're at, that's a pretty neat idea for the right kind of game. It gives you a lot of control, the ability to apply finesse to your story and create a satisfying arc along with your players. It's something to chew on if you run out of Halloween candy you've been sprinkling behind you in the woods. Chapter 9, The Fun of a Flashback. Warning, we're getting into major spoiler territory here. Turn back now if you have never seen Over the Garden Wall, I beg you. As Wirt and Greg's adventure starts to draw to a close, we learn a lot about what is really concretely happening to them. Much to my surprise, the first time I watched it, the boys are modern lads. They're dressed funny and old-timey because it's Halloween night in the real world, when they, through a series of unfortunate events, fell into some water and started drowning. The world all that's happening in is not the unknown. It is very known. It is some small, current-day American town with football games and crushes and tweens daring each other to tell spooky stories in the cemetery. There's no dream logic here. The danger they're in is not psychological. It is very real. I read once that this episode was originally meant to fall in chronological order, that the story would open with the boys' true origins and situation and go from there. I am so grateful they moved it to the end. It would have gutted the whole adventure to have that information from the beginning. There's big lessons for us as DMs about when we give the players information here. In general, I'm not a fan of holding on to info with an iron fist. You need to mete out clues and intriguing details with enough volume and frequency that your players are excited to uncover the next thing. They shouldn't feel like they're banging their heads against a big blank wall. I'm simply suggesting be thoughtful about how you hand out the information. When deciding what information to make available and when, ask yourself not just if it's relevant, but what effect having it now will have on the tone of the game and how it could potentially motivate or take the wind out of your players' sails. I love to use flashbacks in my games. I use them all the time in my homebrew campaign, particularly Felvrold. I've got a whole video out there about the Felvrold setting you can check out if you like. In that setting, I deploy flashbacks as a tool to let my players discover information in unique, intriguing ways and to break up the monotony of people playing the same character with the same problems for a long period of time. Sometimes when my players reach a place in the world where some significant historical event happened, I have them receive a powerful vision from the past. I whip out character sheets for a group of tiny gnomes that saw a castle fall from the sky attacked by dozens of dragons, or character sheets for a group of storm giants, the personal guards of the storm giant queen tasked with a special mission that's gone awry. I let them play through the flashbacks. Of course, this has to be structured in a way where they can't mess up what players know happened in the present. As I've said many times before, there should be a mutual agreement between DM and players to tell the story together. My players aren't intentionally trying to mess my shit up, and I'm making events open enough that they have room to play without wrecking everything. If your players are anything like mine, they will be pumped to play usually a higher level character than them, perhaps a race that's not normally playable, maybe characters that are famous heroes or villains in your world. Through these flashbacks, they get to discover information about the past in a very active way. It breaks them out of the normal routine. My players always get pumped for a flashback, and I suspect yours might too. That brings us to our final chapter. Chapter 10. Your players are the plot. A lot of things happen to Wirt and Greg in Over the Garden Wall. They encounter whimsical locales and locals and face terrible deprivation, danger. But at the end of the day, the story isn't about things that happen to them, it's about who they become and the relationships they build. The final conflict isn't really about the beast. It's about Wirt's evolution into someone who acknowledges his love for his very worthy brother, takes responsibility, and acts heroically to save them both. Not every gaming group is big on the kind of role play that character arcs require. And that's fine. Again, every group is different and wants different things. That's okay. No way of playing is morally superior to another as long as everyone at the table is safe, respected, and having fun. But for those groups that do get there, this is something to pay attention to as a DM. Sometimes we're so wrapped up in frantically building the road as our players venture down it that we can forget. Sometimes the more significant story is not about our plot. It's happening between the player characters. How are they growing and changing as a group, as individuals? How can you acknowledge this as a DM and nurture it? It's a question I think is worth exploring. This goes for above board at the table too. No matter how the game itself is going, if your players are growing together and being friends to each other in real life, guess what? You're running a great game. Sometimes the magic really is the friends you made along the way. Thank you. If you've listened for this long. It turns out I had a lot to say about gaming and Over the Garden Wall. More than I realized, and I still feel like I just scratched the surface. I'm going to be highlighting other spooky movies and TV specials as the month goes on and talking about what they can teach us about storytelling and DMing. Please chime in the comments. What classics do you think deserve this kind of attention? Thank you for exploring the feminine urge to play Dungeons & Dragons with me, Owlbear Rogue. Because if dreams can't come true, then why not pretend?